Okay, good morning, everybody, and welcome back to our human biology classes. And this morning, we're going to finish off our discussion about tissues. Remember, we talked about molecules. We put molecules together, form cells, and now we're putting cells together into tissues of different structure and different function. And we've been talking in particular about connective tissue so far. We talked about compact connective tissues, dense connective tissues, tendons, bone, and this is the last slide which we discussed, which was cartilage. Now we're going to move on to talk about another connective tissue, which you surely know something at least about, which is the loose connective tissue called blood. Blood is a connective tissue because it communicates between different tissues all around the body. That's why it's classed as a connective tissue. And so blood's an extremely complex, complicated connective tissue because it contains many different components and many different kinds of cell as well. But all of the cells of blood all originate in the bone marrow. And surprisingly enough, although they're very, very different to one another, the cells all have a common origin. They share actually a common ancestor in the red marrow of the bones. We're going to see later on some more features, especially when we talk about the immune system. So the blood cells all originate in the bone marrow, and then they go into circulation in the body. And they circulate in a fluid. That fluid is a complex solution of salts, proteins, and various other components. And that those areas where it carries, especially where it carries red blood cells, we refer to it as serum, the fluid that these blood cells are suspended in. But there are other areas of the body where this fluid circulates without red blood cells in it. And when that is the case, we refer to that as lymph. And you may have heard about the lymphatic system. The lymphatic system is a circulatory system that carries this clear fluid called the lymph. The rest of the circulatory system carries those cells plus red blood cells. There we usually refer to the fluid that they're suspended in as serum. So there are three main groups of blood cells. The first, the ones you probably know about already, called the red blood cells. And the red blood cells, their responsibility is to convey oxygen around the body. They are filled with a protein, very complex protein called hemoglobin. And hemoglobin will pick up oxygen in the lungs, and then the blood circulatory system will carry the hemoglobin inside red blood corpuscles to all of the parts of the body, where it will release oxygen for the cells to respire. So that's the main responsibility of red blood cells. There's another group of cells actually quite closely related to the red blood corpuscles, but which are very, very small. And they are called the blood platelets. And the blood platelets, their responsibility is to propagate clotting in the blood, especially when of a cut or an injury, anything like that. The platelets will cause clotting to occur. And that there's a specific mechanism that I'll tell you about. The last group of blood cells are the white blood cells. And the white blood cells are mainly involved in the immune system. There are many kinds of white blood cells. They also, you'll see them referred to as the leukocytes, Leukocytes, the leukocytes, and simply means white cell. They're white because they have no hemoglobin in it. They're distinguished from the red blood corpuscles because they have no hemoglobin. So all of these blood cells are circulating in serum, and the white blood corpuscles you will also find in the lymph as well. So here are red blood corpuscles, also called the erythrocytes, as you can see here. Just give me 1 second, please. So these here are erythrocytes. Here's one here. And you can see that it has a distinctive shape. It's a flattened, rounded, cushion-shaped cell with a hollow in the middle on either side. So there's concave on either side like that. It's a very distinctive shape. They are strange cells because they have no nucleus. They do have a nucleus when they're busy developing in the bone marrow, but it's lost during development. And they're a living cell. They have an active membrane and everything else, but they have no nucleus. They're packed full of hemoglobin. That gives them their red color. And that's the distinctive color of hemoglobin because it has iron in it as an essential part of the molecule. And so the hemoglobin will pick up oxygen where oxygen is rich, and it will dump oxygen where oxygen is poor. It's very useful because we send the red blood corpuscles to the lungs, which are full of oxygen. The hemoglobin picks up the oxygen. We send the hemoglobin in the red blood corpuscles to the distant parts of the body where oxygen is poor. It's been used up by metabolism and everything else. When the hemoglobin arrives in those areas where oxygen is poor, it'll dump its oxygen. And then the red blood corpuscles return to the lungs to be re-oxygenated again. These are the erythrocytes, or red blood corpuscles. I should also tell you one other thing, because we'll mention it again later at one point or another. The red blood corpuscles, under normal circumstances, they are very easily deformed. They can fit between very, very small spaces. So this is very useful because they have to reach the very, very ends of our blood circulatory system where the blood vessels divide into very, very, very fine endings and then make their way as well in between cells, all the time dumping their oxygen to feed the cells with oxygen and make their way back eventually into the big vessels of the blood circulatory system. So they've got to get through very small spaces, and they are very easily deformed without being damaged. They can fit between spaces very easily. I mention it because there are some diseases where, in fact, this flexibility is lost, and that causes tremendous problems. One of the diseases you may have heard of is sickle cell anemia. In sickle cell anemia, the flexibility of the red blood corpuscle is lost, and instead it forms a brittle, sickle-shaped cell like this, which causes tremendous problems because it clogs up the capillaries and things like that. Okay, so here are the blood platelets, and this is a good picture because it gives you a comparison. Here are the red blood corpuscles here. And this is under a microscope. This is what they look like. Here are the red blood corpuscles here. And in between them, you can see these little tiny bodies here. These are the blood platelets. It's a living cell, but it also has no nucleus. And so this is a special microscope technique called scanning electron microscopy. It's an electron microscope, and it gives us 3D picture. And this is a blood platelet. Now, the way in which the blood platelets work, it's important to know that as long as blood platelets are kept moving in the blood circulatory system, they just carry on. They don't do anything, have no effect on the blood. But as soon as you stop platelets from moving, they begin to release proteins called clotting factors, and they cause the serum to begin clotting. The proteins in the serum begin to form fibrils, which begin to form a clot and trap other red blood corpuscles and other blood cells, and eventually form a mass That is what clotted blood is. Clotted blood is blood which has been stopped in one way or another. Now, there are various ways you can stop blood from moving in the body. The commonest place you will see platelets in action is if you get a cut. If you get a cut and the cut bleeds, then what you've actually done is you've stopped blood from circulating. Where the blood is pooling, you've stopped it circulating. Blood platelets will begin to release clotting factors, and a clot will form. That is familiar to all of us, because that clot formation, first of all, it plugs up the cut blood vessels. And second of all, it forms the basis for healing, for a scab to begin to form. So this is a very, very essential and useful feature of the blood platelets. There are cases where the blood platelets do not function properly, very often because the proteins they release are defective. And in those cases, people suffer from clotting disorders. Their blood does not clot appropriately. There is another place where blood clotting becomes extremely important, and that is in cardiovascular disease, in heart disease and things like that. What happens in those cases is if blood vessels are narrowed or have deformities introduced into them, they tend to stop the blood from flowing smoothly, and platelets begin to accumulate around the clot, around the deformities in the blood vessel walls. And as soon as the blood platelets accumulate and stop moving, they start releasing clotting factors, and they can cause a clot to form in an essential blood vessel. And that is the basis of a heart attack, for example. So blood platelets and their function is extremely important to us. We'll hear more about it a little bit later on. Here are the white blood, some of the white blood cells, not all of them. There are many different kinds of white blood cells. But I just want to point out a couple of different things to you. First of all, you'll see that there are lots of different kinds, but they're distinguished by the fact that they have different shaped nuclei. This is one single nucleus, but it has all this weird lobes and everything on it. They're also distinguished by the way in which they stain under standard techniques. So under this particular staining technique that they're showing here, this one stains red and this one stains blue, which is an important distinguishing feature between them. There are two that I want you to pay particular attention to, and they are these ones here, which are called the neutrophils, and these ones here. Now, when they're circulating in the body, in the blood circulatory system, these ones here are called monocytes, but these can actually leave the blood circulatory system and they can enter the tissues, and they do. All of our tissues are full of cells which are derived from these. And when they go into our tissues, we call them the macrophages. And they behave rather like amoebae. If you know what an amoeba is, it's a single cell protozoan. It creeps around. They're motile, they can move, and they can creep between the cells of our tissues, and they wander around and around. What they're doing is they're looking for foreign invaders, especially bacteria. And they can pick up other things as well, but they're especially good at picking up bacteria. And if you, for example, spike yourself with a thorn or something, you break the skin, you introduce some bacteria into your skin, these cells that are wandering through the tissues will very soon pick up that there's something foreign, and they will send out messages to the rest of the body. And the first things that respond are these, and they respond in masses. These are the neutrophils. These are actually this is the watchman. This is the cell that sends the alarm, says something's wrong, something's wrong, something's wrong. These are the soldiers that respond, and they flood in. They are able to find the cell that is signaling to them, and they come in their thousands, tens of thousands, millions. And these little cells can actually vigorously eat stuff up. They can eat damaged cells, they can eat foreign invaders, they can eat bacteria, etc., etc., etc. So these are the guys that actually do the fighting in that instance. When they don't live very long, they live only days. These are long-lived. These ones are not, and they will very soon die, and they don't move out of the area. They accumulate there, and that is what you see as pus. If you have an infected cut, which is busy, your body is busy reacting to, you'll see that you produce pus, white pus, and that is mostly dead neutrophil cells. They're there for a good reason. They're there to try and battle invading bacteria and things like that. I'll just mention this. These guys here are very largely in the things which are responsible for allergic reactions. They have a useful set of reactions as well. But when you suffer from allergies, asthma, all those sorts of things, these are the cells that are particularly involved with that. We won't discuss why now. The last kind of white blood cell I want to point out are these. You can see they're kind of smaller than the others, and they have a nucleus that fills the whole cell. There, like that. There's very little cytoplasm. All of these, they have a lot of cytoplasm and kind of large nuclei with different lobes to them. These just have a spherical nucleus, almost fills the cell. These are called the lymphocytes. And there are many kinds of lymphocytes. But these are the cells which are responsible for producing things like antibodies. We'll talk about that later. But I mention it now because you will have heard with the COVID crisis, you will have heard about antibody. This is the way in which we develop immunity to pathogens, is that these cells actually learn to produce substances which will neutralize a pathogen, like a virus. But it takes a while for us to learn to do that. One way to teach our lymphocytes how to recognize a pathogen is to vaccinate. And that's, of course, the great struggle at the moment with COVID, is to find a good, reliable vaccine where we can teach our lymphocytes to produce the correct antibody that will protect us from infection. Here is an actual a photomicrograph. This is a preparation which has been stained, and it's been stained especially to show up the white blood cells. But you can see other things as well. These here, all of these that haven't stained, that blue color, these are all the red blood corpuscles. These are erythrocytes. And you can even see here's a platelet there as well. So the platelets are these small bodies. Here are the erythrocytes. And here are some white blood cells. Okay. And this one here, this one here, and this one here are all neutrophils. Let me just go back. So those are all neutrophils there. You can see they've got this peculiar, here, have a look here, because I'm going to show you this in a minute. This blue stained one here, there it is there. That's called a basophil. You don't need to remember that, but it's called a basophil. So these are neutrophils, there, and there. Platelet, red blood cell. This here is a lymphocyte. There are many kinds of lymphocyte. We can't tell what kind this is by looking at it, but there are several kinds of lymphocyte. This here is a monocyte, and not to put too fine a point, and you can easily recognize a monocyte. Do you know why? Have a look at this nucleus. What does it remind you of? Do you know what the peach emoji is in your computer? It's just what that looks like, right? It looks like, here you can see here, it has these two lobes to it. And it's very distinctive. So there, that's the monocyte. Neutrophils, there, because you can tell by their strange shapes of their nuclei. And this is a basophil, stains deep blue. This is a lymphocyte. All I want you to remember, neutrophil, monocyte, lymphocyte. Learn to distinguish those, okay, because you'll quite likely see them in a test. Okay, so that's our loose connective tissue. We will talk more about blood later on, especially when we talk about the immune system. And now we're going to talk about some other really specialized tissues. These are not connective tissues anymore. And this now is one, of course, which is familiar to you in some ways, and that is muscle. Muscle is an extremely, extremely specialized tissue. And it is specialized, obviously, for movement. But in fact, there are different kinds of muscle. All of the muscles work because, do you remember I told you about cytoskeletal elements, about these tubules and fibrils that are formed inside cells by proteins, by specialized proteins. All of the muscles work with these fibers. The muscle cells are packed with these fibers, and they are able to slide against one another. And that can produce contraction of the muscle cell. The muscle cell, by the way, can't expand. It can't force those apart. It can only contract them, but it can relax them. And other muscle cells can then pull the individual cell apart. So there are three kinds of muscle cell. The first one is the one that's familiar to you, and that is called voluntary or striated muscle. And that's the muscle that we can will into contraction. We can get that muscle, we can tell that muscle contract, and it will contract. So that is voluntary muscle. It is called striated muscle. You'll see the reason in a moment. It has a very distinctive look to it. And it has stripes in it, which gives, that's what striated means. It means striped. The next kind of muscle is called smooth muscle. And this is muscle which is not under voluntary control at all. It is under nervous control, but it's under control of a part of our nervous system that we don't have voluntary control over. It's called the autonomic nervous system. We'll learn about it later on. The autonomic nervous system just operates through, it is driven by the brain, by all sorts of things, but it is not driven by the will. We can't say to the muscles in our intestine, contract, and have them contract, but they are contracting the whole time without us thinking about it. And that is a special kind of muscle. It has a distinctive look, and it's called smooth muscle. The next sort is very specialized muscle, and it looks kind of halfway between striated and smooth. Again, not under voluntary control, but this is cardiac muscle, and it has a very special characteristic that I'll tell you about in a second. Both of these operate under nervous control. They contract under nervous control. Cardiac muscle is a little bit special, as I'll describe to you. So here's what I meant by saying that the fibrils in the muscle slide against one another to cause the contraction. This is very simplified. Here are the two kinds of protein fiber inside the muscle. One is a thin fiber here, and that's called actin. And then there's this thick material here, which is called myosin. And these fibers can be pulled in. So I've got actin there, and I can pull them towards one another. And do you remember I showed you these things called protein motors? Well, we have protein motors here in the myosin, and they actually can pull those fibers together. And you'll realize, if I pull both of these together, I'm going to pull those together. And that's exactly what you do. When you flex your arm, that is exactly what's happening. You're pulling those fibers against one another to shorten the muscle and contract it. But I told you that muscle can do that, and you can relax your arm now. You can relax the muscle completely, but it's not pushing those fibers apart. You have no ability in your muscle to push fibers apart. So how do you get your arm straight? The answer is you have an opposing muscle. And underneath you have a muscle called the triceps. Contract your biceps, your arm flexes. Contract the triceps and your muscle, the arm opens, and the relaxed fibers of the biceps are simply pulled passively apart, ready to go contract again when you tell them to. So that is how the muscles effectively work. They work against one another in that way to first of all contract and then be pulled into the open position again to be set. So here are different kinds of muscle, and you'll see that they actually look different to one another. And there are just very distinct differences. Here's skeletal muscle or voluntary muscle. Voluntary muscle is a strange cellular setup because, in fact, this whole thing here is one cell. It's one very long cell. There are no cross walls to the cell. Instead, there's a long, continuous cell with many nuclei. Here you can see the nuclei here. So this is a multinucleate cell. When it's mature, it's a multinucleate cell. And all of these bands that you can see in here is a very careful, repeated organization of actin and myosin. What you're seeing is myosin stripes and these stripes here, which are kind of an anchoring protein that the actin is tied to. So those stripes you see in striated muscle is this and this, repeated one after the other. And they form these distinctive stripes or striations there. So that is striated muscle, skeletal muscle, voluntary muscle. This is smooth muscle. This is muscle which is associated with all of the involuntary movements of organs. For example, probably the best example would be the muscles of your gut. The gut has smooth muscle running all the way through it, very, very carefully coordinated, and is coordinated by this part of the nervous system called the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system is continually responding to instructions from the brain, but from in unconscious part of the brain, which drives impulses, which keep, for example, your gut is muscles are continually contracting and relaxing, contracting, relaxing, contracting, relaxing parts of the gut to move food through your gut. That is all under totally involuntary control, and it is governed by these cells, which are smooth muscles. They are individual muscles. We say that they are spindle-shaped. You can see there. So they are spindle-shaped cells. They only have one nucleus. You can't see the fibrils, the way that the organization of the fibrils, the way you can in skeletal muscle, but they still have actin and myosin fibers, which are causing them to contract. And this is smooth muscle, involuntary muscle. This here is cardiac muscle, and it looks kind of halfway between the two in a way. It doesn't have the very distinctive striations. It does have some visible striations of, it is also multinucleate, and it has this organization that the cells actually communicate with one another. They're actually joined together. Now, what is special about cardiac muscle? These muscles need a nerve impulse to actually contract. These muscles, the cardiac muscles, do not. Cardiac muscles inherently contract and relax, contract and relax, contract and relax. Even if you can grow cardiac muscles in a petri dish, and when you grow cardiac muscles, there's no heart organization or anything there. but you can see the cardiac muscles twitching and contracting. But the thing is that if they're just left on their own, they contract in a chaotic fashion. There's no predictability to how the muscles of the heart are contracting when they're left on their own. Instead, an electrical impulse is needed, but it's needed to coordinate the beating of the cardiac muscle. And so we have what are called pacemakers in the heart, which regulate the contraction of the cardiac muscle and make sure that the heart beats, the different regions of the heart beat in synchrony so that the heartbeat is efficient. If that impulse is interrupted, then the heartbeat there is lost and the heart just begins to twitch in a kind of chaotic fashion. And that is a term you've probably heard of. It's called fibrillation. And it's extremely dangerous because when the heart is fibrillating, it is not pumping blood efficiently. Often it's not pumping blood at all. And that is the reason, for example, why many of those of you who are sportsmen will have seen that very often now at sports events or in sports halls, whatever, there are defibrillator machines which are designed to actually defibrillate the heart. They're designed to shock the heart, to shock the cardiac muscle back into a coordinated rhythm. You've all seen those scenes in TV things. They put the paddles on, send an electric shock into the heart to reset the heart, to reset the pacemakers if fibrillation has begun. That's the reason. Okay, so let's have a look. I actually don't need you to remember all of the detail here, but I just wanted to show you a bit about how the muscle is actually organized. Because it's rather complex. This is the whole muscle. This is a thigh muscle. This is the thigh bone here. But the same thing would apply to your biceps. If you feel your biceps, what you're feeling is this whole muscle here. And the muscle is very carefully organized. It has a tough outside, which joins onto the tendon that joins it to the bone. So this tendon is not just like on the end of the muscle. The tendon actually is joined to connective tissue, tough connective tissue, which shrouds the entire muscle. Inside there, this is the muscle itself. And you'll see that it's broken up into these segments, all with connective tissue in between them as well. And these here are called muscle fiber bundles. Muscle fiber bundles, because when we look at them, here's an individual one here. It's one of these. So here it is here. This is a muscle fiber bundle. These here individually are the muscle fibers. And each of these muscle fibers is one cell. It's one muscle cell. It's one of those cells that we saw with the many nuclei all the way down them. They're very complex construction. And I'll just tell you very briefly about the construction because it impacts on how they work, on how muscles work. And later on, I'm going to ask you to refer back here and remember what I've told you. So here's an individual muscle cell. This here on the outside of the muscle cell, that is the cell membrane there. Here's one of the nuclei. Remember, they have many nuclei in these cells. Here's the nucleus here. You see this stuff here. All of this is labeled sarcoplasmic reticulum. Well, just think back. Reticulum, reticulum, reticulum. Where did you hear about reticulum before? Endoplasmic reticulum. Do you remember? Endoplasmic reticulum was those organelle, there was all those envelopes that filled the cytoplasm. So, well, that is exactly what this is, excepting that it's just very specialized here. And in fact, it contains masses of calcium. And the reason for that is that calcium is a switch. if I release calcium into the cell, all of these elements here will contract. So that is how muscle works. We'll take here, you'll see running through the muscle along, all along here, along the muscle fiber bundle here, are nerves. And when a nerve impulse reaches these, it will cause this to release all of its calcium, and the muscle cells will contract. When I stop that, immediately I stop it. This is very, very swift, very, very swift. This immediately sucks back all the calcium. It sucks all the calcium up so that the contraction stops. The muscle just relaxes. But remember, it can't expand. I have to contract the other muscle, the opposing muscle, in order to stretch it out. So that is the function of this. This is sarcoplasmic reticulum. It's specialized endoplasmic reticulum. If you don't remember what that is, go back and look it up. And this contains calcium, which is released under nerves impulse to cause the muscle to contract. Here, this is the muscle fiber here. One cell, but you can see it's packed full. These, don't worry over much about the structures here. Just realize what you're looking at here, cut through at the end, you're looking at all of these fibers that slide against one another, all of the actin fibers, etc., that are going to slide against one another to cause the muscle to contract. Those are called the myofibers. These individuals here are called the myofibrils, and they're made up of myofilaments, actin and myosin. I hope that's clear. Okay, we'll run through it again. The whole muscle, and then muscle fiber bundle here. And that's a bundle of individual muscle cells called the muscle fibers. And the muscle fibers, in the center of the muscle fiber cell, is packed full of myofibrils, which are the elements that will actually contract to cause contraction of the muscle. So here's the cardiac muscle again, and I explained how it works. The reason that these cells communicate with one another is that if one cell starts to contract, it communicates that contraction to all of the other cells. So remember what I told you. The cells, cardiac cells, actually generate the contraction themselves. Once one starts to contract, it'll cause all of the others around it to contract as well. And all of those contractions can all be coordinated by putting in a regular electric shock. That little electric jab comes from the pacemakers normally. So this is cardiac muscle. Here you can see that they have nuclei here, and here are long cells with the nuclei in it, and they have branches which lead to the other cells on either side. Okay, so this is now smooth muscle. And smooth muscle is innervated. That means it is supplied with nerves. And it is supplied with nerves by the autonomic nervous system. And the nerves of the autonomic nervous system actually spread out all over the smooth muscle in a sort of a net of nerves. And they look a little bit different to normal nerves, which we'll see in a while. And these nerves regularly release substances which will cause these cells to contract. Then opposing muscle cells are contracted to expand those cells again, ready for another contraction. And again, if you want to think of a simple example, the easiest example to think of is those movements of contraction and relaxation down the gut, called peristalsis, driving food through the gut. That would be a typical action of smooth muscles. They're also present in the reproductive system. It's what causes muscle contractions during orgasm. They're also the muscles, for example, which cause contraction of the uterus during birth. Many places all over the body we have smooth muscles which are operating under autonomic instruction from the nervous system. So here are some here. Again, they are spindle-shaped, a single nucleus in the middle. Here, not as obvious, but you can look at these micrographs really carefully and see if you can make out what you're looking at. Here's a spindle-shaped cell there, and there's the nucleus. The easiest way to look at them, orient yourselves with the nucleus, and then try and make out the cell shapes around them. Okay, so let's finish this discussion of tissues by talking about nervous tissue, our fourth kind of tissue. Nervous tissue is, again, extremely specialized, but it is actually derived originally from epidermal tissues. That when you look very, very early on fetus development, that is where it originates from. But it's very soon in development, it becomes extremely specialized and very, very complex. And there are many, many, many kinds of nerve cell. But they all have a particular characteristic. They all have sensory function, and central to their function is the ability to respond to and to produce a nerve impulse. And a nerve impulse is essentially a form of electrical communication. It's not really electricity in the way that we kind of use electricity from a battery or anything like that. But it does depend on electrical charge. So nerve cells are able to produce a nerve impulse, and they are able to receive a nerve impulse and respond to a nerve impulse in a particular way. The way in which they respond depends very much on the cell that you're talking about, on its function. But that is essentially its function. Now, the nerve cells can actually communicate with many, many, many kinds of cell in the body. They don't only communicate with nerve cells, we've already heard. Nerve cells communicate with our muscles to cause muscle contraction, right? Nerve cells communicate with other nerves. Nerve cells can communicate with glands, with smooth muscle, with all sorts of parts of the body have nerves which communicate, and that is our central way of coordinating the whole function of the organism, is through this nervous control. Much of it unconscious. It's a substantial part of it conscious, responding consciously as well to the environment and to stimuli in the environment. So let's have a look at the structure of the basic nerve. Remember, this is really the typical nerve, but nerves may be specialized in all sorts of ways, which make them differ from this. So first of all, it's a cell, and it's a cell. It has a cell membrane, plasma membrane all around the outside. It has organelles in it, for example, often they have a prominent nucleus, which you can see here. They usually have one part of the body of the cell which we can recognize as the cell body, like here. That's not always situated here. Sometimes we have a cell body sitting rather strangely here with the nucleus in it. But this cell here has here branches, very, very fine branches, which are called the dendrites. And the dendrites are receiving information. They may be sensory in themselves. For example, this might be a nerve which is responding to touch. If that is the case, then these dendrites will respond electrically to pressure. If you press on them, they're going to start to produce a nerve impulse. If they, in the end, if they do produce a nerve impulse, that nerve impulse is going to run down this part of the cell here. And this is called the nerve axon. And there. Now that is, remember what I told you, this is like an electrical impulse. And many of the nerves, especially if you want the nerves to run fast, and efficiently, then they often have these cells all the way down. These are cells which insulate the axon, just the way that you insulate an electrical wire to prevent leakage of the electrical impulse. It's kind of the same function here. These here are called Schwann cells, and they contain a substance called myelin. And myelin is a lipid, and it's a very, very good insulator of this nerve axon that's running through here. So the nerve impulse is going to run in this direction here. Now the nerve impulse has a purpose, and that is to communicate information. So it's got to, somehow or other, it's got to communicate with something, either another nerve cell or a gland or whatever. It's got to somehow communicate. And they communicate through the ending of the axon, and that's called the axon terminal, and that's here. And we're going to see in a while that there are different ways in which a nerve can communicate. But there it is there, the nerve. So we've got the cell body here, dendrites which receive information, receive enough information, they're going to form a nerve impulse. The nerve impulse is going to run down the axon, and it's going to end up here, and it's going to have to be communicated to something at the end there. These here are the Schwann cells which insulate the axon. I'll just mention one thing. You will have, I'm sure, heard of diseases where people start to lose muscle tone. They lose the ability to contract their muscles and that sort of thing. And these are often diseases which involve the breakdown of these Schwann cells and the loss of the myelin. So things like amyotrophic sclerosis, those diseases are all involved with the loss of nerve action to your muscles, for example, because of the loss of the myelin sheath. So here's some micrographs to show you. This is a typical kind of spinal. This would be a spinal nerve, and here's the nerve cell. The other name for nerve cells, of course, is neurons. And here they are here. This is the nerve axon here running off. You see these cells here all the way around. They're labeled here neuroglial cells. These are cells which support the nervous system. They have many responsibilities. They're very, very important. We're not going to talk about them, but I'll just mention them because very frequently when you hear about somebody having a brain tumor, these are very frequently brain tumors will originate in these support cells, the neuroglial cells. This is a relatively simple cell. It's here are dendrites coming into the cell body. Here's its nucleus here, and there's the axon going off here. But cells can become highly, highly specialized. And here is one here. This is a sensory nerve cell. And these are its dendrites. The cell body isn't even shown. These are the dendrites which are going to feed down to a cell body. And you can see, look at this and realize that all of these dendrites are able to pick up information. Maybe it's, let's say it's pressure, touch. They can pick up that information and relay it down to the cell body. They can be very, very extensive. This one I put up mainly just because I think it's such a beautiful picture. This is a special micrograph stained, and these are cells, nerve cells of the retina. And the light actually is coming in this direction here. It would be coming in this direction here. Rather strangely, the cell bodies are packed into layers like this. These are the cells which receive the light and convert that into nerve impulse, which gives us our sight. But I just think this is a very beautiful preparation. Here's another one here. These are cells of the cerebellum, which is part of the brain structure we'll hear about later. You can see the cell bodies quite clearly. And then these are all dendrites here. I don't know where the axons are, but these are all dendrites here, receiving information there and communicating one cell with the other. Okay, so we just need to think for a minute about how these nerve cells actually communicate, because there are big differences in the way in which they communicate depending on what they are communicating with. So first of all, the first thing to think about, many cells communicate with other cells. They relay information from one cell to another. And in our brains, there are extensive networks of neurons for neural processing. They communicate with one another back and forth to process information in an extremely complex way. So this is how nerve cells communicate with one another. Again, here's the cell body, here are the dendrites. Our nerve impulse is running in this direction here. And here are the axon terminals here. And the axon terminals are close to another nerve there, but it's very important to realize that the nerve impulse cannot just jump. It cannot just jump from one cell to another. It is in fact a gap that it has to get across. We somehow have to communicate across a gap between one cell and another. It's a very small gap, but it's a big barrier to any electrical activity passing across. So that gap there is called the synapse. And we have somehow or other, we've got to be able to communicate across the synapse. And the way in which it is done is this cell, when the nerve impulse arrives at the end here, the cell will release substances, which are called neurotransmitters. And those substances are released across, and they're picked up by the next cell. And when the next cell picks up those neurotransmitters, it causes this cell to produce a new nerve impulse. Okay, so it's not the actual nerve impulse that's jumping across from one cell to another. The nerve impulse arrives here at the end. It causes neurotransmitters to be released. They go across the synapse and they cause the next cell to generate its own its own nerve impulse. So that's a synapse with another neuron. This here is what happens when a nerve synapses with a muscle. And you can see here, these are called neuromuscular junctions. And they are specialized junctions because they're a specialized neurotransmitter, which is released from the end. And that neurotransmitter, when a nerve impulse, this is you saying to your arm, contract. That is you sending a voluntary nerve impulse down here. When it reaches here, it does what I've just described to you. It causes that sarcoplasmic reticulum to release calcium, and it causes the muscle cell to contract. So that is a neuromuscular junction. And the third kind of connection, very, very important, and we'll hear about it when we especially talk about the endocrine system. This is a neuroglandular synapse. Many of our glands will only release substances under nervous control. So that is not voluntary control. It is involuntary control. But nonetheless, it is nervous control. Our glands release substances when they're actually stimulated to do so. And that is called a neuroglandular synapse. So this is a synapse with another neuron. This is a neuromuscular junction. And this is a neuroglandular synapse. There's just one other thing I want to tell you. You remember I showed you before let me show you again. That nerve cells here, they had this sort of insulating sheath around them of myelin. Well, that is only the case for voluntary muscle. So if this muscle here is a voluntary muscle, then this nerve would have that insulating layer of myelin. If it's a smooth muscle that it's communicating with, if this is involuntary, then it doesn't have that insulating layer. In voluntary muscle, the nerve impulse runs very fast down the axon. In smooth muscle, the impulse runs much slower, and that's because it's not insulated. The insulation speeds up the nerve impulse. Okay, so I think that's it for today. And what's the purpose? Well, the purpose of all this, I would say for us, we are specially designed. We have a special organization which allows us to appreciate what's happening around us, and we appreciate that because of the organization of our cells. We have special neural organizations, for example, which give us a heightened consciousness, which allows us to admire things, love things, etc., etc., etc. If you want to use your neural systems to their full potential, you need to develop them, and to do so, you need to read. You need to be reading. That's why almost every lecture at the start, you'll see on my first slide says, those who read succeed. If you read and you try to understand not only your immediate needs, the class or whatever, but widely, the more you read, the more you try and understand stuff, the more you build those neurological connections, the more you will understand, the better your brain will work. The next responsibility is to teach other people what you learn. We are social beings, and our society only succeeds when we listen to those who know more than we do, and when we teach people what we know, what we have learned. Knowledge does you no good if it just sits inside your brain and you don't use it to build society. Now, all of that is me sermonizing, because in actual fact, of course, if we think about it, what nature really wants is two things. Nature wants, first of all, for your body, your organism, to maintain the best possible conditions at all times. That we call homeostasis. All of our body systems, all of our tissues communicate with one another to try and keep conditions of the organism constant and optimal. That we call homeostasis. The reason we want to maintain homeostasis is we want the organism to be happy and healthy, so that it either reproduces on its own, either reproduces itself efficiently, or else assists other people, other members of the society, to reproduce. That's what nature wants. But we actually stand in some ways a little bit outside of nature, and that we need to think about. Okay, so I'll see you then next time on Wednesday.